The 14th of October 1938 never made it into any history book, yet for Mara, it marked the end of her familiar world. It ushered in a harsher, more biting truth, and the wind screaming through the Cumberlands brought with it the scent of oncoming snow. That metallic taste typically meant it was time to gather firewood and patch the gaps in the walls. But this time, Mara stood on the porch of the sole house she'd lived in for the past decade. She observed her breath clouding in the dull afternoon sky. Her stepfather Harlan lingered in the entrance, his shape outlining the fire's glow behind him as if mocking her. He showed no anger. Rage suggested emotion, but Harlan operated with icy, deliberate practicality. He gripped the doorframe with a hand resembling a twisted root. His gaze swept over the 3 burlap bags beside Mara. "You've turned 18, Harlan stated, his tone monotone, lacking the dramatic malice you'd anticipate from a bad guy, which only made it more painful. "Legally, my obligation ends. Financially, I'm already beyond that. You consume like a farm laborer, yet never pull a plow." He never raised his voice. He merely declared it like an agricultural stocktake, as though she were a donkey that had turned crippled. Mara didn't plead. She understood the ledger of this household. Ever since her mother died during the fever winter 2 years ago, Mara had been existing on borrowed days. She pulled the scarf tighter around her throat, a coarse wool item she had refined, and twisted herself and met his gaze. "I require the sled," she stated, without posing a query. "Also the window frames from the outbuilding. The ones you deemed useless." Harlan halted, biting the inside of his mouth. He probably calculated whether the broken window frames were worth the trouble of disputing. "Take the rubbish," he mumbled, retreating and starting to shut the massive oak door. "But don't come seeking help when snow piles reach the roof. Not kin, not my responsibility." The lock snapped into place, a noise decisive enough to split her existence in half. If you want to see how a forsaken girl can endure a winter that claims grown men, you must observe her actions during that initial hour. The majority would have headed for the town 10 miles down the valley to plead for alms or find employment in the fabric factories. Mara went in the opposite direction. She faced the ridgeline, the mountain's serrated backbone. The altitude climbed steeply, and the vegetation became dwarfed and contorted. She filled the sled, a rough structure with ashwood runners, with her 3 bags, and the 6 substantial, grime-encrusted window frames. The load was enormous. It pulled at her shoulders like a heavy weight, yet she pressed forward into the straps. She didn't merely head into the wild. She moved toward a particular recollection, a piece of wisdom from her birth father Tobias, deceased for 10 years. He had instructed her that the planet is filled with unseen boundaries. He had demonstrated that enduring isn't about battling the chill, but about deceiving it. Mara arrived at the hollow in the terrain called Blind Valley. Her hands were chafed under her gloves, the leather rubbing her flesh raw until it oozed transparent liquid. Hunters steered clear of Blind Valley. It was a rocky basin located high on the south-facing incline, a spot where the wind twisted in bewildering circles. Yet Mara perceived it from another angle. She viewed it via the lens of passed-down knowledge. She halted the sled at the brink of a sharp southward slope. The lay of the land here was precise. The crest behind it shielded the cutting north winds, while the exposed front absorbed the weak winter sunlight from sunrise to sunset. To any other person, it was just a rocky blemish on the hillside. For Mara, it was a storage cell ready to be powered. She didn't pitch a tent, nor attempt to construct a log cabin, which would demand cutting down timber. She lacked the energy to cut down trees. Instead, she pulled out a small shovel from her bag. The soil was beginning to freeze, as frost had already seeped into the top inch. She needed to outpace the freezing conditions. She started digging horizontally into the slope rather than a vertical hole. This approach was about working with the land, not against it. By carving into the hillside, she made the earth serve as a natural barrier. At a depth of 6 feet, the ground temperature stayed steady at about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, no matter if the air above was frigid or scorching. Tobias had taught her this fact while sketching in the dirt. "The earth is a blanket, Mara," he told her. "If you build upward, the wind will tear you apart. But build inward, and the soil will protect you." Her shoveling had a frantic, steady pace. She flung the soil aside, creating a mound. Complete stillness enveloped the mountain, disturbed solely by the sound of metal scraping against rock and her own uneven breaths. She was testing the limits of what was possible, risking everything on the belief that an earthen shelter could serve her better than a conventional structure. On the fourth day, the dugout looked like an open gash in the slope, measuring 12 feet in length and 8 feet in depth. Mara was utterly drained. Her body shook from exhaustion that risked tipping into hypothermia. She had been eating only small amounts, hard biscuits and dried apples from her bag, carefully conserving energy like a precious resource. Now she was tackling an impossible design. This was not a simple root cellar. It was a carefully engineered device. Her plan depended on the window frames she had hauled up the slope. Instead of installing them upright as in a typical home, she built them into a steeply sloping roofline. Oriented exactly south, this stage was essential. The design was becoming real. She collected stones, hefty river rocks that she carried from a creek bed 100 yards below. The work was exhausting. Every rock had to be transported uphill, her boots losing grip on the loose debris. She stacked them along the rear wall of the shelter, the north-facing side. This served a practical purpose. These stones provided thermal mass. They were dark and dense. The idea relied on basic physics. During winter, the sun hangs low and its rays would pass through the slanted glass, hit the dark stone surface, and warm it throughout the day. By nightfall, as the outdoor temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero, the stones would gradually radiate the accumulated warmth back into the space. It functioned as a simple passive solar system, but while the concept is neat, actual execution tends to be complicated. While she attempted to position the bulky window frames, the wind suddenly intensified, a gust hitting the glass like a sail catching air. One frame turned in her hands, its corner striking her forearm and cutting a ragged gash through her jacket into her flesh. She let out a sharp breath and dropped the frame. By some miracle, it didn't shatter, but it slid down the muddy slope. Mara dropped to her knees, clutching her arm. The vivid red blood contrasted sharply with the brown soil. For a while she remained seated, the wind whipping her hair and the chill quickly stealing the heat from her injury. This was the kind of moment when the mountain typically prevailed, when a lone wanderer would give in to the harsh calculations of staying alive. But instead, Mara wrapped her arm firmly with a piece of fabric, clenched her jaw, and slid down the slope to recover the window. She wrestled the frame into position, hammering nails into the wooden beam she had already installed. "Not today," she murmured to the wind. "You're not coming in today." She completed the ceiling just as the first major November snowstorm hit the high ridge with full force. The heavens became a bruised shade of purple, and snow started coming down in thick blankets, rather than individual flakes. Pushed sideways by a gale that howled like an injured beast, Mara withdrew into her refuge. The only light came from one tallow candle she had lit. There was no large fireplace burning because that would use up too much oxygen in the confined space. In the cramped enclosure, she possessed just a tiny clay stove to heat water. Beyond her shelter, the world vanished into a raging white storm. The glass roof was battered by the wind, its frames shaking, threatening to break the sole barrier separating her from annihilation. She sat on her bedroll, leaning her back against the stone wall she had constructed. She waited for an hour, then 2 went by outside. The temperature was quickly falling, heading towards zero, yet inside it remained quiet. The soil dampened the howling wind, and then a sensation came. She put her palm on the stones at her back. They were warm, giving off a soft, dry warmth gathered from the day's sun, pushing back the cold. She observed her breath. It almost didn't appear. She wasn't cold. The system functioned properly. This understanding struck her harder than the chill. While the storm howled for 3 days, burying the mountain under 4 feet of snow, Mara had taken heat from the sun. She didn't only endure, she started working in the corner of her dugout where sunlight struck the dirt floor the longest. Her third sack was opened. Inside was soil she had blended herself, fertile compost taken from the base of Harlan's manure heap. Inside a tiny fabric pouch, she kept seeds that everyone claimed could never be grown in these mountains. Not potatoes or turnips, but seeds meant for a completely different latitude. She placed them in the warm soil of her floor, directly under the glass. Down in the village, people were securing their doors, using up their wood stacks, feeling miserable and dreary. But here, in the hidden nook of the mountain, Mara was constructing a microclimate. Like an astronaut on a harsh planet, she was generating her own atmosphere. The initial green sprout that would later emerge from that soil would be much more than nourishment. It would be a statement of defiance against what was considered impossible. By mid-afternoon in December, the sun was hidden behind the peaks, plunging Mara into a twilight that lasted 16 hours each day. The solitude wasn't just the absence of others, it was a tangible burden, a heavy quiet that caused her ears to hum. The food bags were becoming emptier. She portioned out the dried apples until they were thin strips, letting them dissolve on her tongue to deceive her stomach into feeling full. However, the true struggle had been occurring for weeks in the earth floor of the shelter. The soil stayed unyielding and dark. It refused to produce life, and doubt, cold, and creeping started to enter with the tiny drafts that whistled through the log frame. Had the seeds frozen during the climb up the mountain? Could the soil she blended be too acidic, or maybe too cold even with the thermal mass? She devoted hours gazing at that spot of dirt, trying to make it split open. She obsessively examined the thermometer, a discolored brass device she had rescued from a drawer full of junk. 52 degrees Fahrenheit inside, 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside. The heat storage of the river stones was maintaining stability, controlling the nighttime drop. Yet biology followed its own timing, unmoved by her urgency. Each day consisted of a routine of upkeep that seemed almost like a ritual. She would get up before sunrise, removing the frost from the interior of the glass to allow maximum light penetration. She would turn the water barrels placed along the east wall, dark steel containers meant to absorb the morning warmth. She cleaned the moisture away, battling the ongoing danger of mold that could destroy her delicate ecosystem in just one day. Her existence reduced to tending unseen roots and saving every calorie. Her loneliness had become a tangible presence, occupying the room's corner as it observed her. During the depths of the lengthy nights, there were instances when she contemplated returning to the village, enduring the disgrace, and pleading for a spot in a barn. However, the recollection of Harlan's icy rejection stopped that urge. She preferred to perish standing rather than submit. On the winter solstice morning, the year's shortest day, the balance of her survival finally shifted. She spotted a small, pale green loop, no larger than a fingernail, emerging from the dark compost. To a contemporary observer, it would be a spinach seedling. To Mara, it was a decoration. It demonstrated that the universe's rules were still intact, even in this remote corner of the world. This was the first affirmation the mountain had offered. By the middle of January, the unthinkable had occurred. The dugout had transformed from a mere refuge into a contained jungle. The spinach had proliferated wildly. Dark, nutrient-rich, crinkled leaves thrived on the carbon dioxide she exhaled, in the steady, controlled heat from the stones. She picked the leaves one by one. Their flavor astounded her taste buds, sharp, metallic, and bursting with vitality, in contrast to the lifeless gray disk of her hardtack biscuits. Her skin, having turned pale from the onset of anemia, regained its pink glow. The sluggishness from malnutrition dissipated, supplanted by a humming vitality. Yet her setup had one unanticipated weakness. She was depleting her light source, not daylight, but lamp oil. Paraffin was required for her compact heater to augment the stone battery through the impending, severe cold of February. Leaving was dangerous, but remaining meant certain death from the cold. She prepared a basket, enclosing a bunch of fresh, crunchy spinach, along with 3 large heads of butter lettuce. To prevent them from wilting in the arid winter atmosphere, she covered them with a moist cloth. Then she undertook the perilous journey down to the valley. In January, the general store was a dreary locale, a center of suffering crowded with men coughing in the smoky warmth of a pot-bellied stove. The atmosphere reeked of damp wool, old tobacco, and hopelessness. As Mara entered, the chatter ceased, and she appeared spectral. She was indeed thinner, yet her eyes were luminous and sharp. Unlike the villagers, whose hollow gazes reflected 3 months of subsisting on salt pork and cornmeal, her eyes showed no such emptiness. She set her coins saved from many years of odd jobs on the counter and requested 3 gallons of kerosene. The storekeeper, a bitter fellow by the name of Mr. Henderson, scowled while retrieving the cans. "Harlan predicted the wolves would get you by Christmas," he grumbled, banging the metal containers on the wood counter. "Surprised you're not frozen stiff." Mara remained silent. She didn't reply or retaliate. She merely packed away her oil. However, as she turned to exit, The cloth covering her basket shifted. The vivid electric green of the lettuce leaves blazed against the room's dull brown tones. The silence intensified, akin to a neon sign, transforming from disregard to astonishment. During the deep winter of 1938, fresh produce was legendary. It was exclusively available to the extremely wealthy urbanites, transported by train from southern regions. Here, such things were unattainable. "Plastic?" inquired a man, peering through the dimness. "No," Mara replied, her tone unwavering as she readjusted the covering. She departed before further questions could be asked, leaving the famished men in the room pondering whether they had witnessed a miracle or a figment of their imagination. In a small valley, rumors spread quicker than the wind, especially those that go against nature. 3 days passed before Gareth's curiosity finally overcame his fear of the cold. The bet was accepted by a trapper who understood the mountain ridges better than any wolf. He wasn't cruel, nor was he allied with Harlan's men. He was simply a pragmatist, a firm believer in hard boundaries. If a young woman was concealing fresh provisions up in the mountains, she must have either pilfered them from a neighboring valley's root cellar, or she was being untruthful. Following the faint impressions her boots left in the wind-swept snow, he made his way up to the dead-end valley. Despite having lungs of iron, the ascent left him breathless. He observed her chosen route. Steep, dangerous, yet cleverly skirting the deepest snowbanks. As he reached the top of the final ridge, Gareth anticipated discovering either a frozen body or a flimsy shelter half buried under the snow. But instead, he froze in place. A luminous eye was set into the hillside. The sunset struck the greenhouse's glass panels, casting a brilliant orange rectangle across the vast blue-white snowscape. It resembled a gateway to another dimension, an unnatural geometry in the wilderness. He advanced carefully, rifle hanging over his shoulder, the snowshoes crunching loudly in the quiet. He noticed thin, clean smoke rising from beneath the vent, and the glass was free of snow, melted away by the warmth inside. He rapped on the doors. "Open up!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from the cold. The door, a bulky construction of insulated boards stuffed with straw, creaked open as if by its own accord, revealing Mara standing there. She wore a skinning knife on her belt, yet her expression remained serene. She bore no resemblance to a victim. Instead, she seemed the commander of a vessel. "Clean your boots," she instructed, gesturing toward a coarse grass mat. "The soil is holy." Gareth entered and was engulfed by a wave of air thick with the sense of damp soil, crushed foliage, and moisture. That aroma belonged to June, yet it was the heart of February. He blinked as his spectacles immediately misted over from the abrupt heat. When his sight cleared, he gaped slightly, seeing ranks of lush greenery extending into the hillside. Encircled by river rocks that emitted heat, this was no sorcery. It was clever construction. He took in the water casks, capturing the weak sunlight, the tilted panes amplifying the luminance, and the soil insulation storing warmth. Then he turned to Mara, truly observing her for the first time. She was nothing like the discarded orphan the townspeople portrayed. She was an expert constructionist who had triumphed over winter. "Harlan's a fool," Gareth murmured as drips from his beard fell onto his coat. He extended his hand and felt a spinach leaf, pressing it between his fingers, as though verifying its existence. "Right now, this is more valuable than gold. The town is unwell. Scurvy is creeping in. Children's gums are hemorrhaging." Mara wasn't handing out gifts. She remained next to her stove, fingers close to the blade, aware that in this world, respect required bargaining power, not weeping. She required protein. He required vitamins. "Like venison, cured and smoked," she stated in a monotone, matter-of-fact manner. "I can't simultaneously hunt and maintain the glass structure. Plus, I require glass containers to store the surplus." Gareth studied the girl, then the garden that had beaten the winter. It dawned on him that she was no refugee but a resource provider. The balance of power had totally reversed. "I'll deliver a deer tomorrow," he said with a gradual nod, "skinned and cut into quarters in exchange for 3 baskets of this produce." It was a small fortune, almost a theft, yet equitable. The doubtful observer had transformed into a collaborator, and the mountain girl had just launched her initial trading route. The winter season finally gave way, as all winters must, yielding to the muddy, volatile spring of 1939 when the snows at last thawed, exposing the brown wounds of the land. Mara didn't merely come down the mountain. She made her descent as an entirely new being. She had ascended as a needy child, cast aside by a man who viewed her as a burden. She returned as the sovereign of her own fate. Harlan was on his porch watching the sled glide down the path, its runners making a hissing sound against the mud. The sled wasn't empty. It carried jars of preserved greens, seedlings prepared for the spring market, and smoked venison. He remained silent. Nothing needed to be said. He noticed the trapper Gareth by her side, hauling a crate of her goods with the care one would use for a powerful explosive. The community, anticipating a burial, was treated to a lesson in mastery. Mara had done more than survive. She had cleverly carved a path out of being prey. She walked by her stepfather's home without glancing sideways. The affirmation wasn't from his apology, something that would never be offered, but from the indisputable reality that she was still here. She had constructed a stronghold of glass and rock, and in that process, she forged a self that could never be forced out. Mara's greenhouse remained upright for 4 more decades, proving that the term impossible is frequently just an easy label for a challenge. We haven't found a solution yet. What she demonstrated is that when the world shuts a door, you don't merely seek a window. You construct a framework, orient it toward the south, and capture the sunlight. Her tale goes beyond vegetables. It speaks to the bleak periods in your own existence.